According to the Pew Research Center, more than 43 million Americans hold student loan debt, totaling over $1.7 trillion. That's more than the GDP of many countries combined. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Tuition Talks, where we dig into the impact of higher education debt in today's world. I'm your host, David Parr, and joining me today is Evan Aronow.
Yeah.
Alrighty, an expert in economics and public policy. Today, we're talking more than about just numbers. We're talking about lives, choices, and futures. Evan, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Now, let's just start with the basics. How do student loans impact someone's credit score or financial future, especially for those just starting their adulthood and just overall adult life?
Yeah, so the impact of student loans on credit score can be quite nuanced. On one hand, making the payments on time can help establish a student's credit score, which is pretty important. But having a higher debt to income ratio for students post-grad could be a detriment to their credit health, of course. Um, the heavy burden of the loan can weigh down students who are trying to build their way towards, establishing their own wealth. They're coming out of school, they're going to work, they're working hard, and they're trying to establish at least some sort of wealth for themselves, whether the goal is owning a home, buying a car, things of that nature. So it could be an uphill battle for many students.
Definitely. So, from what you're seeing, are people actually delaying these milestones, like buying homes or starting families, just because of this student loan debt?
I definitely think that a lot of student loans a lot of students are putting off their goals as a result of the loans that they're facing. I mentioned housing, housing prices are going up across the nation, rents going up for people across the nation. So, for many students coming out of school, especially in more recent years, that those goals can seem farther and farther away.
For sure, for sure. I definitely see that perspective. So, student debt is often seen as a young person's issue, but it seems to affect more people than we realize. How is student debt affecting not just young adults, but older Americans as well, especially those who took out loans for their kids or return to school later in the future or later in life?
Right. So we talked about how this is affecting the younger generation, but for older generations of Americans as well, paying off student loans,
Mhm.
either for themselves or, as you mentioned, for a loved one, can be equally, if not more challenging. Many Americans are working with their retirement in mind. So the additional debt, with fewer years to recover from that debt, can
Right.
create strain and hardship for many Americans, and can, as we were just talking about, putting off milestones. Some people have to have difficult discussions about putting off their retirement. So I feel like definitely is impacting older Americans just as it is younger Americans.
Exactly. Now, Evan, would you say we've still underestimated how deeply this debt can affect people long term?
I feel like we haven't fully grasped the scope of how impactful the debt is. I think as the years progress, we're going to start to see more and more just how harmful the national debt has become in terms of student loans.
Right.
And the unfortunate side effect is that many Americans who are coming out of high school are simply passing up on the opportunity for a higher education. They're not going to college, they're not going to universities because they think that the cost of doing so is too great.
Definitely. I feel like, especially this generation, we're finding new career paths or just new overall routes other than just the traditional college route. Now, from this perspective, let's shift over to careers. How does student debt influence the kind of jobs borrowers take after graduation?
So I certainly think that the cost of student loan is causing young Americans to seek out higher paying jobs. Um, this is just in order to counter the cost of the education itself. The problem
Definitely.
is that there are not many of these high-paying jobs to go around, of course.
Right.
Otherwise, we'd all be in a much better financial position, certainly. I think some students are finding that the traditionally normal job isn't paying the bills. And so that's certainly causing people to seek out higher paying jobs, especially if they're thinking about home ownership or property ownership and things of that nature.
Definitely. Now, do you think that student loan pressure is making people prioritize salary over passion or purpose?
I absolutely think that that's coming into play because it's becoming more of a survival tactic. Going to work is
Mhm.
more about surviving the economy. It's more about paying back all the loans and debt that you have, and less about finding a job that you're really passionate about.
Definitely. Now, there's definitely been a lot of talk about canceling student debt entirely. What was widespread forgiveness actually mean for the average American citizen?
So widespread debt forgiveness could potentially function in a way similar to what we saw with the stimulus checks during the COVID-19 pandemic, but that would come with similar side effects. So the economic stimulus would increase spending overall, which in turn would boost the economy. However, such a rapid rise in spending among consumers is sure to raise inflation.
Definitely. Now, just looking ahead, what programs or policy changes are currently in place that show promise for borrowers?
The nice thing about today's job market is a lot of employers are starting to offer or even consider offering tuition assistance program for students, especially students that they have their eye on prospectively, who are going
Right.
to be coming into their workforce in the near future. Um, I think it's a very positive step, especially because it goes a long way towards deepening the relationship between the employees and their employer. Some states at the state level have offered refinancing programs for student loans, which is
Mm.
also a very good step. Um, President Biden, during his presidency, made waves with talk about the topic of widespread student loans. As we can see, that did not come to fruition.
Right.
The current administration is considering similar alternatives. They're also revisiting the issue, but right now we have no clue what's going to come at the federal level.
That's real. Now, I know that you did just mention Biden's efforts, but honestly, do you think that we'll ever see real reform in our lifetime, or are we just placing advantage over a broken system?
I'm cautiously optimistic about widespread solutions, especially at the federal level. Having witnessed firsthand what decision making looks like at the federal level in Washington, D.C., these things take a lot of time,
Mm.
unfortunately. There's a
Right.
lot of red tape surrounding federal legislation. So while I think it would be in the best interest of all Americans in order to get something like that tabled sooner rather than later, uh,
Mm.
it's important now that we're talking about the first steps.
Well, that was great. Thank you so much for that, Evan. This was an
Absolutely.
incredibly eye-opening conversation. You've helped to break down a complex issue in a way that makes it personal, practical, as well as powerful. If you're watching and you've got student loans or you're thinking about them, you're not alone and you deserve transparency, support, and reform. Thanks again to Evan Aronow for joining us today. I'm David Parr, and this has been Tuition Talks. See you next time.